Hello, and welcome to Creating a Family. Talk about adoption, foster care, and kinship care. Have you ever wondered what it's like for a biological child to grow up in a family full of siblings from different races, cultures, or ethnicities? You're in for a treat today. We have a conversation ahead of us about growing up as the only biological child in a transcultural, transracial, very large adoptive family. My name is Tracy Whitney, and I am your host for today's conversation of growing up in a transcultural adoptive family. Elaine Duncan is a writer, speaker, and strategist whose work bridges storytelling, healing, and social change. She began her career at Morgan Stanley, where she rose to become vice president of marketing for a Wall Street portfolio manager, before she transitioned into corporate social responsibility and leadership roles in the nonprofit sector. Elaine has a passion for improving outcomes for underserved young people by fostering community collaborations that expand opportunity and build resilience. She is currently working on a memoir that traces her own life journey of resilience, identity, and belonging. Welcome to Creating a Family, Elaine.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're glad to have you. Can you start us off with a brief summary of your family story? What your home looked like while you were growing up? What role did adoption and cultural diversity play in that family dynamic? And how it felt to be part of that big community inside your home?
Sure. So my mother had me when she was 21, and she had two miscarriages before that. And when I was born, she had to have an emergency cesarean, to give birth to me, and then stayed in the hospital for a few days. And her mother, my grandmother, took me home from the hospital. So that was my first mother, in a way. And then, my mother wanted to name me Sarah, and my grandmother named me after her best friend, Elaine, and kind of introduced me to her, 5 days after I was born. So my relationship with my mother started off in a really kind of complicated way that, I had no control over.
Mm-hmm.
And, looking back now, I think that was probably the most impactful thing that happened with my mother and I. My first brother was adopted when I was 8 months old, and he was an American adoption. And then about 3 years later, they adopted my other brother from Korea, and then a sister, probably 5 years later, who was named Sarah. So I was the oldest and the firstborn until the next child, who was an older brother who was adopted from India. And then kids came pretty much every year after that. We had sets of siblings within our family. And to my mother's credit, she really cared about finding some kind of biological connection for all of the children. And she was a social worker. She started her career at Catholic Charities, and then, worked for other organizations. It was always international adoption. And then she ran her own adoption agency for several years. So she traveled internationally, which was one of the things that, made my childhood very different, because she would take me with her. So starting at age 6, I was traveling with my mother to India, to Korea. We were working in orphanages. And that was an incredible experience. And, I'm 54 right now. So, back then, none of my peers were doing things like that.
Right.
And as I grew older, I was a escort, for children.
Mm-hmm.
So, I can remember flying back on Piedmont, with two babies in my arms, and I was 10 years old. But I did have some really unique experiences with her, and I always knew how lucky I was, because she would share that with me. And I had these personal experiences of working in orphanages. So from a very young age, I knew how lucky I was, because I had seen poverty, like real poverty.
Right.
And I loved my mom. I mean, I thought she was larger than life. She was interviewed by so many people. And we grew up in right outside of Baltimore. She was interviewed by Oprah when she was an anchor in Baltimore, and on the Donahue Show, and on Richard Scher. And, she was a real trailblazer with international adoption, especially. And she spoke at conferences, and oftentimes she would take me with her to, talk about being the only biological child. And she would prep me beforehand.
Mm.
And it was always about how lucky I was. So over the years, my parents adopted 15 children, and they came in at all ages from all areas. We also had foster children, and we had foreign exchange students, and even, a homeless couple that she brought in when I was, I think, 19. I was away at college and I came home for a weekend, and she had given my room away. And she literally said to me, because I mean, obviously I was a little upset. And she said, "You have had everything given to you your entire life. You can sleep on the couch in the living room. These people need help." So no matter what was going on, I was always just expected to be grateful.
Right.
And I was never really allowed to be different. And, that had a pretty big impact, especially with my grandmother. Um, and then at one point, when I was 8 years old, my mother converted our family to being Mormon. And so that was a whole nother thing. Um, and that's probably another podcast.
Another topic
But
entirely.
but I think, one of the reasons that she did that is because she needed help. And the church helped us so much. I mean, they
Mhm.
brought over food, and she was still traveling a lot. And my father was working all the time.
Yeah.
So, you know, the clothes and the hand-me-downs and the food and that sort of
Mhm.
thing. And I didn't even know how to feel about that, but my grandmother had a lot of strong feelings about that. And I can remember her saying to my mother, "You have this beautiful child and you don't even take care of her, and you keep adopting these kids."
Mm.
And so I was kind of in this triangulation
Ooh, yeah.
of, where do I belong and how am I supposed to feel?
Right.
And I had these two very, very different dynamics of living in a pretty chaotic house and then going to my grandmother's and having my own room. And she would like wash my clothes for me and take me shopping. So there was always this dynamic
Right. And
of,
you were stuck in the middle.
one foot here
Yeah.
and one foot here.
Yeah.
And my father's family was, we're talking about a totally different generation. And my father grew up in a very kind of working class, blue collar home with parents that
Mhm.
were prejudiced.
Yeah.
And so they kind of stepped away pretty early. It was when my brother was adopted from India. And, he had very dark skin and they had some feelings about that. So they kind of stepped away. So I didn't
Mhm.
have this aunts and uncles and all these things because everybody thought my mother was crazy.
Right.
So anyway, it was a very unique childhood in so many ways. And there were wonderful things and opportunities that I had that none of my friends had and most kids didn't have.
Right.
But it was also very confusing and being bopped around and always being told that I should be grateful.
Mm.
It did create significant challenges for me as I grew older, especially not knowing how to talk about my feelings.
Right. So the thing that's resonating with me right now is the feeling grateful. That is something that we hear many, many adult adoptees warn adoptive parents about and talk about how it made them feel and how hard it was to kind of bear up under the pressure to be grateful without any acknowledgement of the losses that adoption brought to their life or how they landed in this family that is now telling them they should be so grateful when they've had to say goodbye to first language, first family, first community, the first culture that kind of helped make them who they were. And it's interesting, any child who is made to feel as if they should be blanket statement grateful as a condition of their belonging in that family and their identity is something that all parents should take note of in this conversation and be concerned about and cautious about. And you also mentioned issues of race and culture. So I wondered, in your extended family, those were complicated and fraught conversations. How did your immediate family handle those conversations? How did many, many parents who are listening to this, or hopeful parents who are listening to this, want to know how to blend all of the different cultures that they may have represented in their family or in their prospective family dynamic? And so conversations about race and culture need to be had, but can you give us a kind of an inside look at maybe how your family handled those conversations?
Sure. So, I do remember, I mean, obviously I was 8 months old when my first brother was adopted, but I do remember before we adopted my younger brother from Korea, and he came in as an infant. He was, I don't know, a couple weeks old, actually. We did have the conversations of we're going to have a new child. We're going to have, and obviously they talked to my brother and I, we were 3 and 4 years old.
Right.
So my mother tried to explain it the best she could. And I remember when my brother came from Korea, I thought my parents had gotten me a baby. I was so excited. And, it was beautiful. And then when my sister Sarah was adopted, it was the same thing. We talked about it and they explained to us what was going on and that I was going to be a big sister and all of those things. And then as the children came, that conversation kind of went away.
Mm,
And I think it's also important to know that we also had sets of siblings within our family. And because my mother kind of was running her own show, you know, she was all over the place in Korea. She knew everyone. I mean, Holt, Lutheran Child Services, especially with Korea. I mean, in the 80s, Korea was like
right.
wide open.
Right.
And several of these children actually, they knew who their mother was. And one of the sets of siblings, there were three, two boys and a girl. And my mother met their mother, who was very, very poor. Her husband had passed away. And, she's told them, like, I will take your daughter, who was severely handicapped, to America and give her a life. And, my parents took her to Shriners Hospital and she got the care that she needed. And then she adopted the two older boys. And I think for adoptive parents, it's really important to understand that, attachment theory. And if you adopt a child that is even 5 years old that didn't have that or that knew their biological mother, it's very confusing, for them to just, okay, that's over now. I have a new mom. I have a new dad. I'm in a new country. So there was a lot of just confusion, I think, as the children came.
Hmm.
And then we had, my mother who wanted to be loved so badly, and that came from her childhood. And these things were not talked about back then, you
Hmm.
know, childhood trauma and attachment theory. And, even though she was a social worker who later became an LCSW, it wasn't talked about. So I think as the children came, and we had a 3 bedroom, 2.5 bathroom home, and my dad just kept building additions onto the home. And, I went from sharing a room to sharing a bed, and I would literally come home from school and have another sibling. So by the time I was in middle school, that was pretty much par for the course.
So the conversations about the actual adoption and building relationship and building connection and attachment weren't happening anymore.
No.
How did your family acknowledge or honor or celebrate or not the different races or cultures that were represented in your sibling group?
Well, back in the 80s, and I don't think it still exists, but my mother was one of the co-founders of an organization called FACE, and that was Families Adopting Children Everywhere.
Hmm.
So she really became kind of an expert on these blended families. And, in her mind, it was just such a beautiful way to create a family that was very diverse. And, all of the children would know more about the culture in India and the culture in Korea and Costa Rica, which again, it was. I mean, we had such a unique perspective about loving each other and not seeing differences, that we were all children of God. And that was really kind of like I think that was really a Mormon thing, or I should
Mhm.
probably say LDS. And I do remember, at our first house, the reason that we had to move was because, our neighbors, my sister was called a chink, my
Mm,
brother was called a nigger, from India. And it
right.
became a big problem. And also, our neighbors thought, my mother was running a group home. So when I was in eighth grade, we moved to an area called Columbia, Maryland, which was the first planned community in the country. And the whole purpose of it was everyone living together,
Mm,
rich, poor, handicapped, not, black, white. And that was a really good thing for our family because we weren't as unique.
not
Um,
quite as conspicuous.
exactly.
Yeah.
So the conversation was always very positive that, we had this very diverse family. We were kind of like the model of it, especially for face. And my mother talked about, putting a family together that was so different. And I
Hmm.
think people thought that it was so beautiful. And in many ways, it really was.
Hmm.
Um, but it was also pretty chaotic and confusing.
Yeah.
And yeah, so, I think that I had a very unique experience.
Yeah. It sounds very unique. If it sounds also as if maybe there wasn't quite as much attention on each culture's beauty and identity as much as it was, we're now a multicultural family and that's our identity. Is that kind of a good summary of that?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. And, these trips that I would go on with my mother, as more children came in, I kind of got pushed aside. And that
Mm,
was, I think part of it was because of this, intergenerational dynamic. But it was very important to my mother that all of the kids knew where they came from
hmm.
and knew what their culture was. And she would start taking them.
How did she accomplish that? Because she's crafted this group identity as a multicultural family, but how did she help the children grapple with their individual identity and culture of origin and things like that?
Well, like I said, I traveled with her a lot and then that kind of stopped. And she started taking other kids with her. So, my brother, who was adopted when he was an infant, he would go to Korea with her. She actually found his whole biological family. I think she found a biological connection for all the kids except for maybe four.
Mm,
But that was important to her. And, we always had kimchi in our house and japchae, and we went to a Korean grocery store, and we all had humbucks, and we had Korean dolls that she would bring back. So the culture in our family was it was more Korean than anything else. I mean, most of my siblings were adopted from Korea,
hmm.
but my brother who came from India, he went back to India with my mother, and he was raised in a Catholic orphanage. And my mother actually brought back one of the women that worked in that orphanage, and she was kind of like our nanny, not in a Mary Poppins way, but
Hmm.
she did our laundry. She made dinner for us. We had curry all the time. I still don't like curry because it was
Too
basically my
much.
food group, curry and ramen when I was growing up. So she really did try, to bring those cultures in, so that we all understood them. So it
Hmm.
wasn't just the Korean children in the family, having pieces of Korean culture. So we all had all these different experiences with, you know, foods, especially, from Central America, from India, from
Right.
Korea. Yeah. So, I mean, she did a good job with that actually,
Yeah.
but, it was only when she was home, and she was rarely home
Yeah.
because she was always in different countries
Right.
saving children and helping families that wanted, to have an international adoption.
Yeah. So she would bring her Indian child with her to India, her Korean children with her to Korea once you were older and they were old enough to travel with her. Where did you learn about and start to form your identity as an individual in the midst of all of this multicultural going on? I don't know what your ethnic background is. For example, I'm an Italian Irish American. So we learned about that from both sets of family. Where did you learn about some of those identities that you were born into?
Well, my grandmother was Jewish, and that's again, a whole nother conversation. She never told anyone she was Jewish.
Hmm.
And again, that generation just kind of didn't. And so
Right.
she married a Methodist, but all of her friends were Jewish. And even the fact that she named me after her best friend,
Hmm.
and I grew up going to Passover dinners with her and Seders with her
Okay.
friends. So I also had that dynamic. The whole religious dynamic, that's a big
Right.
deal also.
Right.
And that made me different
Right.
because I was getting these special invitations to things.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know at the time, what she was actually trying to teach me. So, there were several different identities. There was the identity that I had with my grandmother and kind of that culture. And she cared a lot about what people thought. And I have that. It's something I've worked on my entire life. And always wanting something better than the other kids. And she taught me about quality, and she taught me about, how to clean myself, how to match things,
Mm-hmm.
all of that. And that my mother never really taught me.
Yeah.
So we all came with different perspectives. Even a 6-year-old has a perspective of what life is like. So from a cultural standpoint, we were all very different. Like in school, people thought it was so cool. And I can remember, especially in ninth grade, they adopted my sister from a broken adoption situation. And it wasn't talked about at all. It was like the next day she was there.
Right.
And I had to bring her with me into high school and have her sit with me at lunch and whatever. And I actually took a lot of pride in that. But there was a lot of parentification going on
Hmm.
the whole time
Mm-hmm.
where I felt responsible
Right.
for helping a child fit in, making sure they had what they needed. And so I grew up pretty quickly, actually.
Yeah.
But again, I was never really allowed to have my feelings. I actually liked the attention because it made me feel, different and unique that I
Right.
had this family. But I was the only Caucasian in my family. So
Mm.
I kind of didn't fit in the biggest way. And, and then add to that this dynamic with my grandmother
Mm-hmm.
that the other kids, I think, really kind of resented. I think my grandmother really tried, and she was a kind person. But I remember at Christmas, she would get all of us a gift, but all the adopted kids got pajama sets, which were brand new, very nice pajama sets. And I would get like 5 presents,
Mm.
and one of them was not a pajama set. So
Yeah.
she always kind of pulled me out as being unique and different.
Right. So you had some unique experiences as the only Caucasian and only biological child in this family. And I'm hearing you say that there were times that you felt very, very seen and understood. But then there were also times that you felt very unseen, unheard, unacknowledged. How did you walk the balance of those two diverse perspectives?
That's a really good question. I don't think I even knew that I was walking a balance.
Mm.
I had a very unique experience as an adult in my career. I was running national action strategies for Colin Powell's Foundation, America's Promise Alliance, and that organization was all about improving outcomes for young people. And I had a conversation with someone on a work trip one time, and we were talking about I was going into boys and girls clubs. I was going into all these places and talking to kids, and I was just sharing with him that it's fascinating to me that, we have this, not my kid kind of perspective in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that I didn't understand it. Like, how could anyone let a kid grow up this way with none of their needs met
Right.
and not having the resources, living in a neighborhood that was a depressed neighborhood and not being able to go to a good school and all these things. And that these children, like, what are they supposed to dream about if they don't know what's out there? And it was a really robust conversation. But at the end, he said, Elaine, you have a very unique perspective. You can go in and out. Most people can't do that. You can meet with CEOs and you can hang out in boys and girls clubs and talk to those kids. And that conversation really made me realize how unique my skill set is and how unique my perspective was. But that's what I had to do as a child. I was speaking at adoption conferences with my mother, and I was going back to this home, where I had to be the big sister.
Right.
And even though my birth order bumped around a lot, I was always kind of treated by my mother especially as the big sister, as
Mm-hmm.
the only biological child, as the one who should be grateful.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't make my siblings feel that way, which is a flip to what you
Right.
just said.
Right.
It
Right.
was always that, you know, I was so lucky.
Yeah.
So I really did. I developed the skill of kind of going in and out and being able to talk to anyone from any culture, which was pretty special. And it guided a lot of the pieces of my career. But another piece of my career was that I was a massive overachiever because I never felt seen. So, and we didn't have a lot of money. I still don't know how my parents did it. I mean, honestly, I can remember going to the grocery store and my mother having like 3 carts of groceries. And our community was very generous to us. I mean, people knew that, my mother had saved all these children and they wanted to help with things like food and hand-me-downs and, all of that. So, again, it was these two totally different worlds, but it gave me a very unique perspective. And I had a lot of opportunities because of it. So this way that I grew up, it really became my identity. I mean, I talked about my family all the time as if it was like the coolest thing in the world. But deep inside, I was never allowed to have my feelings. So that was the only way I knew how to really talk about it. And that manifested in several ways.
Shows like this often prompt a lot of questions for hopeful adoptive parents or for those who are already raising kids of another race or culture in their home. If you have questions about adoption, foster care, or kinship care, we would love to help you out. You can send your questions to info@creatingafamily.org, and we may feature them on our Weekend Wisdom podcast. That drops every Saturday morning, and it's a practical, short podcast that helps you strengthen the family that you're raising. And if you're looking for a supportive community of other parents and caregivers who get the unique joys and challenges of raising a transracial adoptive family or parenting transcultural foster kids, please consider joining our online community. You can find us at Facebook/groups/creatingafamily. And we would love to welcome you over there. And I think that you'll enjoy learning with our very active and caring community. It's one of my favorite places to hang out. And so we would welcome you over there if you're interested. Let's go back to the interview now and learn more about growing up as the only biological child in a transcultural family. So you've shared with us a little bit about the challenges of being the only biological child in a very large adoptive family. And then you just shared some positive skill sets that came out of that. I wonder if you could kind of take it practical for a moment and maybe offer a few pieces of advice for prospective parents or parents who are already raising transracial adoptive families how to avoid or prevent or buffer their biological children or resident children, as we sometimes call them, from feeling kind of overlooked or lost in the mix.
I think there's a lot of ways that that can be done. And again, I just want to say that, that kind of thing was not talked about back then,
Mm-hmm.
and it's still not talked about. And, you and I have had several conversations before this conversation. And I think one of the biggest things is, to acknowledge that biological child and to also, you know, not just the biological child, but the siblings. And, another thing that my mom used to say was, we loved you so much that we wanted more children. And that was kind of confusing too. Um,
See how that would be confusing. Yes.
yeah. So, I think honoring that biological child. I mean, I was 8 months old when the first one was adopted, so that would have been a little tricky. But we did, as part of the LDS culture, we had something called Family Home Evening, and that was on Monday nights, and it was an opportunity for the whole family to gather. And we did this, we converted to that faith when I was 8 years old, so we did it pretty much through when I was in high school. And it was
Mm-hmm.
an opportunity to gather as a family, and everyone, we went around the room, and you would say a good thing and a bad thing that you were feeling. But then it would just kind of go to the next person. So people would share how they were feeling, but uh, it was never really discussed any further than that.
Or acted upon, it sounds
Exactly.
like. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think they did make an effort. Again, my
Mm-hmm.
parents were so young.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember when I turned 50, I was thinking about like how old was I when my mother was 50, and thinking about she did so much of this
Mm-hmm.
in her mid to late 20s
Mm-hmm.
and 30s. And I was an idiot in my 20s. Like, it helped me give her a lot of grace.
A little
Um,
perspective.
Yeah. So, I do think they tried.
Yeah.
But the reality was with that many kids and with my mother's drive, she
Right.
wanted to be seen as different and unique. And she was. And
Mm.
she was a trailblazer. I mean, she was so dynamic and, could captivate a room. And she did have the credentials. I mean, she became a PhD therapist, in her late 50s. So I think she really tried,
Yeah.
but she also didn't do it very well. And, my father was just always working. And at one point, especially when my mother was running the private adoption agency, she started forging his name on things. And he was just kind of this defeated guy,
Mm.
but worked all that. He loved all of his children and really, wanted them to have their needs met and things like that. So I do think they did the best they could.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was just kind of this roller coaster, snowball that kept getting bigger. And at one point, I think it just became almost unmanageable.
And I think, too, looking back on it, generationally speaking, they came from a generation that's still very highly prized assimilation and everybody being like each other and not seen as different or unique or diverse. And it sounds to me as if maybe there was some of that kind of carried into, although she did seem to prize their country of origin and things like that, maybe there was still some of that kind of lingering that made it hard to talk about the differences and hard to address the individual child because it was more about the family group.
And how can you with that
Right.
many
With
children?
that many kids. Right.
And, I have had several conversations with adoption experts and specialists. And, the question always comes up like, why would someone adopt all those kids?
Mm,
And I think one of the biggest things I think about is looking at, what is the parent's motivation?
mm-hmm,
Why do they want to adopt a child from an international,
mm,
in an international situation?
That's a very practical pre-adoptive question that we encourage families to ask themselves frequently. What are your motivations? What are you looking for? What do you want out of this? And there's no right or wrong answer,
Right.
but it's a useful skill to be able to ask yourself that question and answer that question honestly, because it sets you up for an openness to be able to flex with whatever comes, because you may have an ideal in your mind of what you're hoping to build, but the ideal doesn't always happen. And adoptive parents, foster parents need to be nimble and able to respond to what is happening, not what they had hoped or planned to happen.
It's a beautiful way to say it.
Our former executive director used to say, you have to be managing your expectations enough that you can parent the child that's in front of you, not the one that you thought you were going to get.
It's a beautiful way to say it.
Because those children change just as much as we change, just as much as we grow or stop growing. Our kids change. And the child you have when you first bring them home versus the child that you have 10 years in, 15 years in, could be very, very different in their needs, and their expressions of those needs hopefully are changing and growing as you're changing and growing. And that nimbleness, I think that nimbleness comes from the ability to be humble and say, what am I looking for out of this experience?
I think that's right. And I also think, these conversations about childhood trauma were not happening
Mm-hmm.
back then. They just weren't. And, even if you adopt a child when they're 1 year old,
Yeah.
they do have challenges from that. And epigenetics is a very real thing,
Yeah.
and generational trauma is a very real thing. And there's a lot of research that's just come out over the past decade about trauma living in the cells. So, if you don't know a child's story, which in many cases you don't, and what they've been through, and I mean, I can remember going to orphanages with my mom, and there were 3 kids in a bed,
Mm-hmm.
barely being touched, and actually one of my brothers, he's, 50 years old, he still has a flat head from
Mm-hmm.
literally being in a crib for the first couple of years of his life.
Mm-hmm.
What does that do to a child's psyche?
Mm-hmm.
What trauma are they bringing along
Mm-hmm.
in their cells? And that just wasn't even talked about back then. We didn't think of it like that. So it was like, adopt this child and you're starting all fresh without even considering where the child came from and what would be best for them and what do they need. The brother that I just spoke about, probably would have been better off being adopted by, a family with 1 or 2 children so that he could get the attention that he needed.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have a lot of that attention. We kind of raised each other. And then as older children came in, that almost became part of their job, raising the younger ones. My older sister, she's the one that cooked for us and did our laundry and things like that. So, there are so many dynamics that, I really think need to be thoughtfully talked about. That
Yeah.
just back in the 80s, it wasn't like that.
Yeah, the study of trauma, into mainstream conversations is definitely newer than the adoption culture is. I'm grateful for the benefits of learning what I've learned because I'm newer in the adoption experience than obviously you are. But it's even newer than that is the intergenerational trauma conversation. And we actually recorded a show recently, trying to remember who the guest was, but it was an excellent conversation about intergenerational trauma. And we can link it in the show notes for people that are interested in learning more, because understanding trauma and how it impacts a child's developing brain is crucial to adoptive and foster parenting across the board. And then digging a little deeper into intergenerational trauma can give you insight, not just to the child that you're parenting, but it can also give you great insight into your own parenting style, your attachment style as you're trying to raise these children. So I highly encourage prospective or hopeful adoptive parents to consider adding conversations about intergenerational trauma to their parenting toolbox.
hmm I just going back to the question of why. When I was 47, I suffered from very quietly and privately suffered from depression for most of my adult life. And the first one happened when I was 22 and a boyfriend cheated on me.
Mm.
And it brought back, like, why wasn't I enough? Why did you need to do that? And I didn't understand it at the time, but
Mm-hmm.
that's what was going on. This feeling of, wait, I thought you loved me.
Mm.
And then, even work things. Um, I said it before. I mean, I worked so hard. I had to pay for my own college. I did whatever I could to make money, to be able to be successful, and chased titles and chased who I was working for and wanting to feel important. And, my first marriage, that's what it was. It
Mm.
was, a really good guy who I knew would never cheat on me. I knew when I came home, my house would look the same. I mean, that was pretty stressful. Growing up with
The
so many
stability.
children,
Yeah. Yeah.
the house was wild, and I in a and again, none of these things I knew when I was growing up, but this sense of control that, like, if I cleaned something, I wanted it to stay that way, and it didn't.
Don't we
Right?
all?
Yeah. And so,
Yes.
I always had this, like, trying to keep everything perfect and trying to be perfect myself. And that's a lot to carry.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but when I was 47, I did the Hoffman Institute, it's called the Hoffman process, and it's all about childhood patterns. And, when we are born, and I think this is an important piece, a baby, when it's born, starts mimicking its parent,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's its biological parent or its adoptive parent, to almost say, I'm just like you. Do you love me now? And so we start taking on these patterns as infants,
Yeah.
of the people that we were raised by, especially,
Mm-hmm.
and really looking at all of that stuff and the generational trauma and how it affected us as an adult. And I remember telling, you have to do like 15 hours of pre-work, and that's how they kind of match you with your teacher. And I was really fortunate. I had the founder of Hoffman was my teacher, who is still a very important teacher in my life. And he said to me, I have never heard a story like yours. You
Mm.
should be in a mental hospital or dead. And I remember thinking, I mean, come on, you've heard a lot of stories. And he
Yeah.
said, no, I've never heard anything like this. And I was not allowed to be different or anything like that when I was growing up. So it was one of the first times that I really felt seen, like, wow, is my story that unique? And that happened very later in life. And the more I kind of understood, from the perspective of a very seasoned therapist, that I did survive a lot and that was okay. I'm not a victim,
Right.
but it was a lot to have to deal with,
Yeah.
as a child. So I really do. I actually think something like that would be important for any parent to do, but especially a parent that wants to adopt children, to really look at themselves
Mm-hmm.
before they take something like this on. And it's really not talked about very often.
Yeah. We also have fantastic tools in our archives for understanding your attachment style based on the way that you were parented.
Oh, good.
And we find many, many families appreciate the opportunity to look at the challenges that they had growing up and how they were raised so that they can make the adjustments and open themselves to learning and growing to better parent the next generation. One more interruption, if I may. I'd love to tell you about our 15 free courses at bit.ly/JBF support. Thanks to the Jockey Being Family Foundation, we are able to offer you the library of free courses that will strengthen and support your family through many of the topics that you're hearing us talk about today. How to talk to your children, how to talk about adoption, what's the impact of fostering or adopting on children who already live in the home. Those are just some of the topics that these 15 courses cover, and I think you'll really appreciate the opportunity to take the courses, hear from guest experts, and do it all for free. So thanks to the Jockey Being Family Foundation for that. You can find the library at bit.ly/JBF support. That's bit.ly/JBF support. Let's go back to the interview now. You've been frank here about the challenges that you experienced growing up in the home of 16 children, many from different cultures and races and parts of the world. Could you highlight a couple of the things that were maybe challenges growing up, but you've been able to kind of convey them into strengths or skill sets now? You alluded to it a little bit at the beginning, but I'd like to hear kind of like a summary of that part of things.
Well, again, I had a very unique perspective, and I had very unique opportunities. I remember when I went to college, I went to an all-girls college for the first year, and I had a Black roommate. And she said, I've never had a conversation with a white person. And I also saw that, in the work that I did with children in inner cities. I remember one time I went into a Boys and Girls Club, and this one was, I don't know, it was in a housing project, maybe a mile away from the White House. Most of my career was in Washington, D.C. And and I walked in, and this little girl said, "Oh my God, I've never seen a real live white person." And I said, "Wow, well, do I look the way you thought I would look?" And she put her hands on my skin and she said, "You're so shiny." And that is a reality. And that happened maybe, I don't know, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Um, but having this experience of like, what do you mean you've never seen someone that
Mhm.
doesn't look like you?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was really the most profound thing, but also this ability to go in and out.
Right.
But I always had this kind of dual life,
Mm-hmm.
like in some ways, I never felt good enough. I never felt smart enough. I actually also had learning disabilities that were never diagnosed.
Mm.
And I would skip words around and letters around and things like that. And I think part of it came from stress that I didn't even know I was taking on. So to kind of go into the challenges, I feel like we've kind of covered that.
Right.
Um, but I did have incredible opportunities in my career, especially to really kind of weave in my own childhood, into the larger picture. And I also think it's important to mention that, before my mother died, she told people she had 37 children. So after my parents got divorced, um, she remarried a man from Liberia, and they went to Liberia and built schools. And this is when Charles Taylor was still leading Liberia, and so there were a lot of war orphans. And one of the children that she adopted, this girl was oil and water with my mom, and
Mm.
I just loved her so much, and I saw myself in her. And my husband and I actually, she came to live with us when she was 14, so I helped, to raise her. So
Mm-hmm.
even as an adult, I felt a responsibility and an obligation
Mm.
to help children that my mother was not taking care of.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened a few times. She had other children that, she would say to me, "Well, you never had children. I want you to experience this. Why don't you take this one for the summer?" And my father kind of had to get involved at one point. And this is after I was a grown up. I was in my 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Do not let her do this to you anymore." So I don't know if that answered your question, but I mean, throughout my life, it kind of followed me.
I'll kind of summarize what I heard. I heard an openness to many diverse people that you would come across as an adult. I heard empathy, which is an excellent life skill for us to cultivate as adults. But I also heard resilience. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about you have a memoir coming out that is going to kind of trace your life story and talk about your path to resilience. I wonder if you could just give us a perspective on how you see resilience and maybe some practical, ended up with some practical thoughts on how to help our kids, whether they're biological in our homes or adopted in our homes, how to create the conditions for resilience.
I don't think I really understood what resilience was until I was older. And I went to
Yeah.
therapy and,
Yep.
I did a lot of work on myself only to try to figure myself out. I mean, again, these depressions were pretty significant and I didn't really understand them. So, you and I have talked about someone that you've had on your show before, Dr. Jana Hunsley,
Mm-hmm.
and her research is fantastic. And I think everyone who's thinking about adopting should read her research, but especially families that have biological children.
Mm-hmm.
And I met her only a few years ago when I realized through writing this book and doing, looking at comparable titles, that this story has not been told and that the adoption community rarely talks about it. And I think that, part of that is because people just make an assumption that the biological child is resilient because they've kind of had to be. But all of her research made so much sense, invisibility, parentification, peacemaking. I always want everybody to be happy. And then the piece that I think is really important is that the biological child oftentimes takes on the vicarious trauma of the adopted siblings. And, understanding all of those things really helped me to see kind of the root of some of my challenges, but also these skills did help me to succeed, to be able to pay for my own college, to be able to, own a home, and all of those things. So,
Mm-hmm.
I think I didn't have children, so my focus was my career, and again, that was to feel important. But it also, growing up the way I did, makes me an excellent collaborator. And, we had to come up with our own solutions all the time, whether it was
Mm-hmm.
making dinner or what we were going to have for dinner or what we could like go through to try to put some kind of a dinner together. um, to how are we going to, we all had chores. How are we going to split that up?
Mm-hmm.
We actually all got along very well. We helped raise each other.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm a really good leader because I had those experiences. And I also just think having to ask myself a lot of questions. I think I'm pretty in touch, but I absolutely am super. I have a lot of empathy, and I've been told that I'm very empathic, and that comes from absorbing
Mm-hmm.
other people's stuff. So as an adult, I've really had to be careful with my energy. We had no boundaries in my house. So I've always kind of struggled with that and also putting other people's needs in front of my own. But I was
Yeah.
kind of groomed to have that. And
Mm-hmm.
there are good things and bad things about all of this,
Right.
you
Right.
know?
And that's where resilience comes in.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
am grateful for having all those skills,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not going to say it wasn't easy, especially when I didn't really understand. I mean, now as an adult and in writing this book, which has been incredibly healing, and it's kind of three parts. I mean, the first part is the childhood because that's kind of the street cred, to talk about what I want to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very unique childhood, but there were ways that it affected me as an adult that, you know, I don't think I ever really would have all, put together. And
Yeah.
just these practices that come now, especially around my feelings. I feel things in my body. We all do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And where is that coming from?
Yeah.
And really being mindful.
Yep.
I'm a lot more present, I think. I'm very fortunate to have a marriage where I do feel like I'm the number one priority. And that was important to me, even in my
Mm-hmm.
first marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And, feeling seen and feeling like a priority and feeling appreciated, for what I bring to anything,
Mm-hmm.
has been a big theme for me
Yep.
in my adult life. So again, to go back to what you're saying, I think that I'm very receptive. I'm very open. I've never really been a big judger. Um, and, just this feeling of collaborating and we're all going to get there together and what do we need and, you know, that sort of thing. So it definitely affected me in very positive ways, but also challenging ways.
Yeah. Well, I deeply appreciate your vulnerability in sharing the challenges and the outcomes of your very unique experiences as the only biological child in a very large transcultural family. I appreciate the touch points of encouraging parents in particular to educate themselves. Some of the themes that I heard were educating yourself about trauma, educating yourself about your own attachment style, educating yourself about the individual needs and cultures of the children that you're bringing home or planning to bring home. And I think all of those, we're an education focused organization. So those all resonate with me. And we will link some of those topics in the show notes for families who are looking to deepen their education and raise their awareness. So that they can be nimble and they can be responsive to their individual children's needs, whether those children are biological and have been in the home for their entire lives or they're bringing new children in. Elaine, thank you for your time. Thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for your cautionary tales about raising biological children in a home of other adopted children, and we wish you well on your memoir. And maybe when it's published, you can reach out to us and let us know about its publication date so we can share it with listeners who are interested.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.